Hi, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at nationalism, particularly European nationalism in the 1800s, as we seek to answer our essential question: how did nationalism impact Europe in the 1800s? This is kind of a big topic. We're going to take a broad stroke at it today and then dive into some of the individual circumstances coming up. So, what is nationalism? Nationalism is the idea that a people of a particular nation should have political independence. That is, those people who are a nation, that is, a group of people with common language, territory, and history, sometimes religion is lumped in there, should have their own state, their own independent state to govern themselves as they wish. And during the 1800s, nationalism was increasingly replacing the imperial system within Europe, the imperial system being rule over many nationalities. Instead, we're focusing on just ruling one nationality. So, what were the origins here? The origins are really tied in with the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. The idea of it pre-existed that, going back to the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s, but this is kind of a new, broader nationalism that is hitting Europe at this time. And it really comes in the wake of the French Revolution for its ideas and Napoleonic Wars for its restructuring of Europe. This revolution caused the spread of ideas, which were French revolutionary ideas, the idea of liberty and equality, throughout Europe. But they did it under that Napoleonic dictatorship. Once the Napoleonic Empire collapses and nations are shuffling to reorganize their borders, they're left with this idea of liberty and equality, now with greater opportunity for freedom. It will be freedom denied to them, but the idea sticks. So nationalist goals start to set in throughout Europe. Tied in with the collapse of the empire, nationalists wanted to redraw state boundaries to coincide with national boundaries. State boundaries being political, national boundaries being tied to the people who live there, the history, language, culture of those people. Now, this idea was especially popular in East and Central Europe, where state and national boundaries didn't align very well. It's less important out in, France, for example, which had fairly stable national state borders. Not perfect, but pretty good. Great Britain, being on an island, didn't have this issue as much. But we take, for example, here, the Austrian Empire, or what later becomes the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which had a lot of different nationalities within it. It encompassed a very large area with different cultures, different languages, different ways of being. Now, the problem with an empire like the Austrian Empire was that this imperial system placed a lot of different nationalities under the authority of one group, who then distinguished themselves as being a superior group. So you had this relationship of superiors and inferiors, which just always begs to be challenged. Resentment rises up. People who are viewed as the less of the two don't like seeing themselves as the less of anything. And they are constantly pushing back against the superior group to try to carve out their own identity. We see this again within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, also in the Ottoman Empire. This here is an image taken from an uprising of Hungarians against Austrian rule in an effort to carve out, if not in their own nation, if not their own state, but recognition of a separate culture and a state within a state, because of all these differences between the Austrians and the Hungarians. They'll largely fail this time, but after World War I, they will be separated. All right, opposite problem here, problem of regionalism. Germany and Italy are disunited. They're fractured. Okay, there is an area which is largely recognized as Germany and another area that is Italy, but they are not a united state, even though the Germans and the Italians have their German and Italian nationality. They don't have a Germany or an Italy. Now, these nations were largely divided. Germany was just a mess. This is late 1700s, Holy Roman Empire times, just a whole bunch of small states. Italy also broken up into a lot of pieces, although slightly less than Germany. We see this compact area right here with a lot of small, weak states, which don't allow a lot of collaboration, cooperation to defend the nation when there are a lot of little states. And so a lot of these little states along the borders with other people are always being conquered and passed from one nation to another, independence, semi-independence, fully being annexed by another territory in these cycles because they don't have a full nation backing them up. Now, there winds up being a connection here to nationalism and democracy. Once this idea of a nation gets firmly established, it gets connected to a people, right? The French nation is the French language, culture, history that binds the people together. It's separate and distinct from a ruler. An empire is very based on the ruler and what they rule. The nation is based more on the people, who they are and what binds them together. And increasingly, the people of a nation want a government that represents the people. Rather than being a possession of an owner, they want the government to be the possession of the people. And so they're working toward more democratic ideals. But as this idea progresses, both nationalists and Democrats, people who want the nation state and people who want the people to rule the state, believe that democracy works best within this system. That if you have two different nations in the same state, democracy will break down because those two different nations will always vote in blocks against each other. Again, our definitions here, the state being this political entity and a nation being a collection of people with culture, language, traditions, history tied together. Nationalism and liberty are another couple things that kind of piggyback on each other. Nationalists believe that every nation, again, group of people, like every citizen, has a right to exist in freedom. That this group of people should have self-determination. They should be able to decide for themselves what their language, culture, religion, etc. should be. Now, nations do start to develop those own cultures, but we start to see a negative side effect of this during the 1800s that will explode in the early 1900s into World War I. And that is the feeling of we and they. The idea that we do things the right way, our nation has the correct culture, they have the incorrect culture. We can have two very similar societies with very different ideas, and their language shifts about how they talk about themselves versus others, us versus them. Now, nationalism is gaining popularity in Europe, but Europeans during the late 1800s are very not conscious of how their actions aren't speaking to their words. Nationalism becomes really popular in Europe for Europeans, but they don't apply it at all to the rest of the world. They do not look at overseas territories as having the same national rights that they have in Europe. This is especially true with the French and the English or the British at this time, as they are pushing their empires out, especially into Africa, but also into Asia. At their time that they're looking at individual people's rights to self-government and self-determination, they are imposing governments on an entire continent of people and denying them self-governance. So nationalism in Europe at this time does have its limits. All right, that was all for today. I hope you learned something and enjoyed this lesson, maybe just a little bit. I will see you next time. Farewell.